So David Charron is a continuing lecturer at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business. He's taught innovation, entrepreneurship, and investing at UC Berkeley at the School of Business since 2003. He's lead faculty in the NSF and NIH I-Core programs and is the architect of the Pathways for Open Source Ecosystems program. We're really, really excited for the panel that is going to follow David's keynote talk that is in this theme of funding and supporting the ecosystems, the human ecosystems and the connections that power the open source ecosystems. I just said ecosystems like 7 different times. How many times are you going to say it in your presentation? He's held leadership positions at Berkeley, run incubators and accelerators, and worked across corporate, academic, and government sectors. We are really, really delighted to have you here. Thank you so much. Please come on up. Please welcome David. I'm going to play, and all should be good.
Awesome. Thank you, Kirsty. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. That was a great introduction, but I want to start by saying I started in this world of technology commercialization back in 1987. So this is a long, long time ago. I was working at the Stanford Technology Licensing Office, if you can imagine that. I'm a Berkeley person now, but started there. And when we started, there was this organization, I can't remember the name of it then, but it became AUTUM, the Association of University Technology Managers. And it was, at the time that I started in 87, about this size. I can only imagine what's going to happen to the open source program offices and the capabilities and the desire to add to the public good over the next 10 years for all of you here that are associated with the OSPOs or associated with open software or open science. This is a movement, right? And it's a movement that is happening today. It's going to happen continuously going forward, and it's going to be a big part of how the world works going forward. Let's see. 3 years ago, the NSF asked me to create a program, and that program was focused on open source projects that were coming out of academia. In particular, it was focused on activities that were associated with the grant-making offerings from the NSF in open source. At that time, they were just starting their open source POSE program, which gave out $100,000 grants or $1.5 million grants. And the NSF began to realize something along the way, which is all of the things that people have communicated about already, which is people in science are really good at getting grants, but they're not necessarily really good at managing open source software projects in terms of understanding how the communities work, how to get beyond the barriers that are associated with that, and to move forward. Let me just say that keynotes are not my thing. I teach at the business school, and so I've gone through quite an amazing transformation over the past 20 years of open information. When I started teaching at the business school in 2003, students only had case studies on paper in front of them, right? There was no phone. There was no Wi-Fi at Berkeley. There was nothing. And it was a joy. And I learned how to teach in that manner, but it's unusual for me to actually give a lecture. If you have questions as I go forward, please do raise your hand. I'm happy to take questions along the way. This design of the POSE open source activities of understanding how the ecosystems work and how to build a sustainable project, words that you'll hear again, taught me a lot. First, I have open software entrepreneurship title up here on my slide. That's like a really small part, as you all know, of the open source community that is here in this room. We have had teams go through this program that are software, obviously, but a lot of hardware teams, people who are putting out designs for biosensors that they want to be adopted by everyone. We have open data teams where the databases that have been accumulated with respect to health data coming out. A lot of activity in that domain, and obviously open science, and there's a connection to the open science community here too. So wonderful things for me to learn, and there's enormous opportunities for everybody here. All of this is about embodying know-how, right? It's embodying understanding of how the world works into software and trying to improve how the world works over time. That data enables people who are using it and validating it along the way to move the world forward. And so I really want to say I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to take the next 30 minutes of your time. I've now taken up the first 2 minutes that Kirsty gave me. Let me start with a quick story. This is a team that went through the post program. This is a team called Festum. And Remy, who's at the top left there, and James below are the two developers of this program. And it represents very clearly deep science that is coming out of MIT. They are part of the Plasma Science and Fusion Center at MIT. And Festum stands for Finite Element Simulation of Tritium in Materials. I know you're all excited by that. But this leans into and is an important part of the fusion market that is booming at this point, right? Some people would say it's booming. Some people would say it's coming down at this point from an investment standpoint. But getting fusion reactors up and running takes a lot of work. And modeling tritium and the transport of hydrogen in those reactors is an important part of how the science occurs. They created the software. They started to develop it. They did not patent anything, right? So from an intellectual property standpoint, there was nothing from a know-how standpoint embodying what they knew except for the software. It is not proprietary software. So in proprietary software, the entrepreneurship world that I tend to teach in, we know if you're creating a SaaS product, who your customers are. We understand a customer and the details of what they want and what they're using the software for. We can actually see how that happens. But with this program, they had no idea, right? It was a classic open source activity. They put it up online, and people replicated the depot, and they went away. They didn't tell Remy or James who they were. So they were totally blind to that ecosystem. And this is a common problem that we have with efforts that are going out to take a set of knowledge, a set of know-how, and transporting that to the community. It's like, who is in that community? We don't know. And so they went about understanding how that community works, and it's a process to make that happen. And that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit about today. Knowing your customers, KYC for the bankers who are here. Any bankers here? No bankers here. So let me go to the next slide here and say, why are we here today? And this is just a little bit of history because I got very involved with copyright when I was working in tech transfer way back when. Open source is really kind of a unique circumstance because it relies primarily on copyright law. And copyright law is a bugaboo. So those of you who are copyright people, right, if you've dug into the US code, it's interesting, to say the least. First of all, copyright exists just when you create something and you embody your know-how in a material. Good. So as Jared said, the first open source projects were when? They were actually started way back here in the UNIVAC world because the embodiment of know-how was so valuable that people wanted to use that and they wanted to see the source code. But it was copyrighted. So UNIVAC didn't create open source. What they did was they freely distributed software. There was no such thing as open source back then. It was still copyrighted. It was still owned by the company that owned and created the UNIVAC system. The value in the open source and the open know-how is in the inability of the others to replicate that. The cost from an economic standpoint is high. So that's the desire, that's the market pull for these activities. The market pull is that people want the know-how, they want your embodied know-how, and they don't want to replicate it. Now, there are two costs associated with that. One is the replication of just simply that thing, and the other is the economic cost of validation. So if I think about Festum, one thing that it has is that it's used by scientists all around the world. People understand and have validated that it is following the algorithms that work. So fast forward to today, right? And this is not necessarily today, but on the right-hand side, you'll see a notice by the NSF in 2015. If you're thinking about sustainability, one of the ways that projects at academic organizations get sustainability is the grant-making process. While the organizations that are providing that money are insisting that many of the projects go open source, right? They want to see valid value in the information that is being put into these projects. So in 2015, the NSF said, look, put your data up, put your code up, allow people to grab that code and move it forward, okay? The challenge with that is that for most scientists, and how many scientists are in the room today? Got a couple. One of the behaviors that I see in the scientists that I've worked with over time is that when the NSF says you must do something, you do it, but you do it at the minimum state, right? You check the box. And so if the NSF says you have to put your software up, you put it up on Git, and it's a set and forget, right? It's like, well, I put it up, check the box. I have no idea how many people downloaded it. I have no idea who those people are. I've fulfilled my obligations under the grant. We want to go farther, right? We want to push that world farther. We want you to know more about that. So the term open source actually came around in 1998, and it's a fairly new concept for what we're doing, but the open knowledge, the open know-how piece is not. So we created POSE. Now POSE is a dual-sided obligation system. The first obligation is if you can get the grant, you're obligated to do the work that you obviously put in under your aims. But there's a little paragraph in there that says you have to go through my program. Now I'm claiming it to be mine, it's not necessarily mine. We had great faculty who helped create this particular program. And POSE itself is about pathways first, right? It's the pathways to enable open source ecosystems. It's now PSOS, not POSE, because they threw security in. And they said you have to go through the 7-week activity. Now, I want to say that the creation of things like the activity is always interesting. We ran one in 2024 at the end of the year. I think it was, 2024. And we designed it to be a 7-week program, but it actually, the solicitation said it was a 4-week program. Oops. I've never seen more open source people be mad than at that moment. And so we cut it down to 4 weeks, and now we're up to 7 weeks because the solicitation and the program itself have been aligned. This program is designed to get you out of that set and forget mode, right? So the pathways that we want you to consider are really aligned with strategy. Most software programs, most open source, open knowledge programs don't really have a strategy involved, right? So how do you set strategy in terms of what you're doing? And so we want you to consider things like, gee, how do you become a sustainable effort? And we'll come back to sustainability in the other stories that we're going to talk about here today. Sustainability is a part of the strategy. Like, how do you get the people on board to validate the creation and the value that you have in the marketplace? What we call in the business world a value proposition, right? And we've stripped some of these words out of this because from a cultural standpoint, value propositions don't match with the culture of open source. the open source community doesn't like the word customer. We don't have customers. We have people who use our software. So we had to take all the business language and transform it in this program into other things. So sustainability is one of the pieces, not making money, but sustainability. How do you increase your team's capacity, right? So oftentimes the open source efforts that get started at an academic institution start because one person solves a problem that they have, right? It's one person making the code. But that's not enough to sustain a team, right? So how do I recruit people onto my team so that I can continue to grow my product, I can continue to grow my ecosystem? How do I make that happen? That's part of your strategic thinking. Do you want to partner in the distribution of your software with someone like a Linux, or someone like a Red Hat, or some other program that might help you in the distribution and understanding of the ecosystem? And we had one team that was doing that was a Berkeley team. They're in the semiconductor design world, and they had a partner at the Linux Foundation that was going to do all the work for them. Well, this is interesting because from a strategic standpoint, who owns the community? Actually, it turns out that Linux would own that community, and that the researchers here would just simply be creating the software. That puts a distance between the researchers and the community themselves. So we had to get through that and understand what that community management activity was going to be, and what the relationship was to the distributor and who was going to fund that activity. What's the best way to tell your story, right? Because if you have to go out and raise money, let me just say that POSE is a wonderful program at the NSF, but once you get through phase 2, you're done. Sorry. The 1.5 million is your terminal grant for this activity. So one thing that we teach people is how to tell a great story about the value that you create. Because when you go out and talk to a sponsor, you want to be able to tell a great story about your impact, right? And that is not part of many open source projects, right? It just doesn't exist in the way you think about open source and open activities. And then the other pathways are, hey, I'm at the academic institution. Do I stay? Do I go? Do I create a company, a nonprofit, that is going to take this open source activity and move it forward? Am I going to jointly create a nonprofit and a for-profit, which is a model that we oftentimes see, is that there's a nonprofit that has the capability to get the grants and a for-profit that is more focused on revenue. And we've also had, out of the 100 teams that we've worked with in this, we've had people who say, we're just going to move out of academia and create a for-profit company. Strategy, right? It's taking an early stage activity and putting strategy around it. So before you set your strategy, you kind of have to know your customers. So I want to come back to Festum for a minute. Remy and James really had an interesting time going through the program. Again, they were blind to their community. So they went through the program. They did their 100 interviews. Okay, that's what we ask people to do. Go out, talk to people. They started with their insiders, the people that they knew really well. They went to people that they didn't know very well. And they went to conferences, including one of theirs. And you might think, well, why haven't they talked to their customers in a way to understand them in the past? They never did. They were talking about the science. They weren't talking about why people would use the software. So they discovered a whole bunch of things through that process of knowing your customers. One was that they learned about their primary competitor. So no open source project is alone in the marketplace. Almost always there's somebody else in that marketplace. It might be a for-profit company, or it might be a nonprofit, or it might be another academic activity. So they learned that there were certain value propositions that that competitor had that they didn't have. That was really important for them going forward. How did they build their product? They learned about why people would choose not to use their open source activity. This is an important point, just to understand that the market fragments. There are some people who want that and some people who want this. Some people trust this group, some people trust them. And how you build that trust is part of the governance model. And they also learned that there was a whole lab in China that was using their code. They had no idea. They had been using the code for about 5 years, but they had no exposure to that lab. And they weren't getting anything back from China. They weren't getting any code contributions. They were getting nothing back from that group. So that's what they learned. But that wasn't the problem that they were trying to solve. The problem they were trying to solve is what Remy called the two-bus problem. Does anybody know what that means? Some people do. It is your founders get run over by a bus, the whole project goes away. Now, that's the terrible way to describe that problem, right? The right way to describe that problem is the lottery problem, which is if one of your founders wins the lottery, right, they tend to go away. Remy and James told me that there's no way, even if they won the lottery, that they would leave their positions. So I thought that was very good from a dedication standpoint. What they were really trying to do is to understand how they could get more people into their project, because it was only the two of them, and they needed to have other contributors and other maintainers come into the product. And what they had discovered through their interviews was that people really wanted to have fellowships where they could come and learn how to use Festum at MIT. And those fellowships would be sponsored by other academics sending their PhD students and their postdocs to learn at that organization. That is the beginning of understanding their customer side and beginning to get other maintainers involved in the project. That's a slow process, right? Fellows don't come very often, but it was part of what they did. Okay, here's another story. This is a story of the Natural Capital Project at Stanford, a project that's been around since 2006. And what we ask all teams to do is to create an ecosystem map. Why? What the heck are we asking for with respect to an ecosystem map? One is to understand what's going right and what's going wrong with the transmission of knowledge through that ecosystem. So while the program was started in 2006, they started to distribute Invest, their software product, in 2008. Now, you might notice that in the Invest green circle up there, it's integrated valuation of ecosystem services and trade-offs. It has the word ecosystem in it. They were really good at drawing their ecosystem. They really know how to do this. But there's a story about building out the ecosystem itself. And that story is that 3 people on that team were in the same room and they had a whiteboard. And I could watch, as we were on Zoom, them building out their ecosystem model. And what they did is they built that out first, and then they put it here into this software program. Now, I'm going to notice, you guys can't read this, but this says saboteurs. And what they found in this ecosystem model was that there were people out there who really didn't want to see this project continue to succeed. This is true across every one of your projects. There are people who would prefer to have their success and not your success. Understanding who they are is important. The other thing that they discovered in this ecosystem model was that their clients, the people who downloaded the software, were doing really well from a business standpoint. They were fantastic. They would go to clients, governments, cities, policymakers, and they would sell Invest and the services that Invest would do for lots of money. But there was nothing coming back from those organizations to the Stanford project. So they then started to say, well, and I could describe it where it is on this ecosystem chart, but they said, well, how do we solve that problem? How do we get into our ecosystem and create an incentive structure for people to come back to us and have no fear that if they bring their software back to our project, that even though they're enabling the other consultants to do it, the basic mission of what the project was doing was going to be furthered. And so they started to do that this year at their annual conference, is to bring these people together and the developers together, to bring them up the ladder from developer to contributor to maintainer. They're also trying to figure out something around governance. And I want to say that governance is one of the things that we really look at in detail in this particular program. They have, because it was started in 2006, the people who are involved in that origination of the program are, well, they're getting older, right? And the 3 people that we had on the team were young. So they were thinking, okay, what happens here? How do we govern, what's our governance strategy with respect to how this is going to move forward? And that governance strategy really related to building trust in the community, that the project is going to continue no matter what happens, and that the new people who are coming onto the project were as dedicated to that project as the originators of the project. And so we begin to see how governance shifts over time. Now I'm going to stop, and you all know what a BDFL is, right? Yeah. So this is another thing that we saw on many of the teams in the particular program. Out of the 100 teams, many of them were going through a governance change. The BDFL was getting tired. The BDFL was oftentimes an academic. And one of the challenges with academic BDFLs is that oftentimes they were tenured faculty. They're doing great. They've had a job, they got paid, they had great students contributing to the project. And then they one day say, well, what I'd like to do is have one of my students take this over. Well, right away you hit a cost barrier, right? Which is the student is not a tenured faculty. The student needs to be paid. Where's that money going to come from? How do you make that transition from the original BDFL to the next person who's going to take over the project, or the next team that's going to take over the project? And suddenly you begin to look at, gee, where's the revenue going to come from? Are we going to get grants? Are we going to spin this thing out? Are we going to put it in a some sort of structure to help us do that over the next 5 years? How do I get my students interested, or is there student interested? And that governance model is really an important part of the activities that we go through. So the Natural Capital Project is great. They have a lot of money because they do really well from a fundraising standpoint. But the BDFL is a great effort. Here's our BDFL. How many of you are Berkeley people? So you might not think of Rich Lyons as the BDFL. I kind of do. And part of that is that I've known Rich for a long time. So I've known him since he's been teaching at the business school, while he was a dean at the business school. And what he has done now as chancellor is shepherded the innovation culture into Berkeley. So in some respects, Rich is the person who has grabbed onto innovation and entrepreneurship and said, this is going to be a core part of what we do. And in doing so, he said, this is going to be a third pillar for what we do at the institution to validate our public good, right? What we are supposed to do as a public institution is to get things out to the public that are going to enhance the public good. So we usually do that through papers or research dissemination, but entrepreneurship and innovation are core to that, right? We can change the world more from looking at it from a business structure standpoint or developing software and moving it out. So in some respects, he is the BDFL. And this is an important part of how Berkeley's moving forward. This is an interesting chart. So some of you may have seen this before. This is the ecosystem of Berkeley at this point. So up in the upper left, academic programs where we teach people how to be entrepreneurs or teach people to go through the Lean Launchpad. We have new product and R&D support systems. We have startup support, funding support over there. We have shared carry funds, entrepreneurship and IP support, legal support. We have all of this activity. This is a huge change from when I started at the Haas School in 2003. 2003, you might have been able to put one or two things on this map. So our ecosystem for entrepreneurship and innovation is growing. Where does open source fit on this? Where is the open source community? What do you mean?
Everywhere.
It's everywhere, right? Yeah, but it's everywhere but nowhere, right? So my challenge to you all is to think, okay, how can we get this set of people, bids is on it actually, though it's down here somewhere, to get more representation on this map for the open communities, the open source, the open know-how that is coming from Berkeley onto this map. It is a critical piece because it is everywhere in what we do. Okay, I'm going to start to wrap up a little bit here. This is the beginning of our syllabus, and as somebody said before, the internet is part of the social structure of what we do. We can think of it as a technology structure, but it's also part of the social structure, and open source is a big part of that. And as Tim O'Reilly, some of you may know him, said, open source is the purest form of that free market of ideas. So this structure that we've put together to train and help projects get further with respect to the open source is really kind of an open activity. I'm happy to provide the syllabus for you. You can take a look at what we do. If you want to contribute back to the syllabus, please do. I'd love to hear your thoughts and motivations. One of the things that we did in changing the language was we changed the business model canvas into an open source ecosystem canvas. Just to give you a little trip around this, the blue part is what we used to call the desirability piece. Desirability is basically saying somebody wants what you've created, right? And the desirability is who are your community members, what problems are they trying to solve, and what value does your open source project provide to them? What's the value? When we start with most open source projects, they say the value is it's free. That's not really the value proposition, right? The value proposition is what you're enabling with the particular know-how that you're providing to them. So we have to change the perception of most open source projects to get them to think more about who is in my community and what that value is. And then finally, what's the impact on that side, on that blue part? And impact, again, is not the number of downloads. It's the impact that you might have on kids learning how to use databases, how many teachers use that particular product, how many projects are run in the classroom, how impactful that is in terms of the educational perspective. So that's the blue side. The operational side, which is really around sustainability, is like, how do you do this? Who's going to be writing the code? What's happening here? And then the green side is, of course, the money side. And we have to get people focused on, the funding sources. If you're going to stay in academia, you're going to be really good at getting sponsored projects. Can you get revenue? Is there an opportunity to go out and do consulting, to provide services that can generate revenue? And what about in-kind support? Can you get people to give you, whether that's on that map is BSAC. BSAC is a large consortium of companies. Can you get those people to start to contribute? Whether that's money or in-kind time, seats on a board, whatever it might be. How do we get that done so that the sustainability really comes out? Okay, I'm going to end with just a quick story. This is a great team from CMU called the MLC team. They had 3 people on the board. Rui Hang is a PhD student. TK in the middle, he calls himself the community manager, but he's an associate faculty member at CMU. And Yuan Tang is their industry mentor. So this is how we construct teams. There has to be a mentor. There has to be a community manager, somebody who is interested in building that community out. And then the team lead is the person who does most of the interviews. 3-person team is great. What they did in software is they developed a bunch of different tools. And those tools, I'm just going to name them off because they are all very interesting today value products, right? So there's a machine learning compilation tool. Mirage, which is an image, I think that's an image tool. FlexFlow, XGrammar, and WebLLM chat. These things are all very popular today, but they had no idea how many downloads they were getting. But it turns out they're getting about 5 million downloads a month. And so, surprise! And they didn't really know their community at all. So they had a great time interviewing everyone, and I'm going to give you their top 3 aha moments. So number 1 is that AI native development is transforming open source software. For those of you who are here, I think you recognize that, right? But to hear that from the people that are downloading your software and how they are using it, that was like, oh my goodness, is this a 2026 thing? Is this a 2027 thing? Is this going to be something going forward? So that transformation is there. They learned that ecosystem integration can beat standalone innovation. What the heck does that mean? What that means is that you can think of your project as a standalone project, but it's usually not. It is usually embodied in a whole bunch of other projects that are out there in the community, and your ability to interact with those other projects is more powerful than you're developing your own. Now, there's a dependency problem in there. We'll just kind of skip over that. But the integration, the ability to join into that community is an important part of what they do. And the other thing that they understood was that mini projects, M-I-N-I, projects, are important for unlocking onboarding. So what they had done is they had built a very large suite of software, which is if you downloaded the whole thing, most people didn't actually start to use it because it was too difficult to understand. It was too difficult and cumbersome to get to work. So what they did is they created little mini modules that people could download, start using, very easy, and then upgrade to the rest of the open source community or their project later. And I think that's a lesson that I think we can all take in, is getting people on board, understanding how they're using it, is a process that parallels what goes on in the for-profit entrepreneurship world. Acquiring customers, not letting those customers go away, giving them the tools that they want is an important part of how you develop your projects. So there's going to be more academic software getting created with AI today than there ever has been in the past. So the opportunity here is to build institutional awareness. It is to build your OSPOs. It is to build the capacity for people to understand how to get to sustainability. What is governance? How do I develop projects over the long term? Or sunset it, right? And I'll say that the one project that I dealt with in the semiconductor world that we had here was great. They sunset their projects every 10 years. I think that's really amazing. You don't get stuck with old software, right? You redo things as you go forward. This wave is getting larger, not smaller. And POSE is one structured response to get it done. But OSMOs are the institutional infrastructure. Open source contribution is a form of scholarly impact. And we have to think of it that way. It does have impact for you. It has impact for your community. It has impact all around the world. And it's attributable, right? It's measurable and increasingly recognized. So the field is moving towards you all. take this moment to think about where you're going to be in the next 10 years and how this is going to be important to you. So I'll stop there and take questions. If you have any.
On the microphone? Yeah. Juanita, PhD student at UC Santa Cruz, is going to run around with the microphones if anyone has any questions.
Up here.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Excellent presentation. Thank you. This was very interesting. So I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, everything. I'm bought into open source 25 years ago. I see two things. I'm at one of the UC campuses, and I lack that recognition of open source software from the leadership. And I think that prevents it from trickling down to the scientists that don't know they need to do this.
Yeah. So how would you solve that problem?
That was the question. Back to you.
See, this is where my teaching style comes out, right? It's like, I don't solve problems, you solve the problem. That's the entrepreneurial way. So I think we're going to get more and more recognition from the management. We have somebody here who's from the UCOP, right? And so how would you solve this problem? This is right in the center here.
You really are teaching here.
Yeah, I am.
With the California Digital Library in UC. I'm with the California Digital Library in UCOP, the system-wide library part. I mean, I think one of the ways you solve it is by promoting up the value that's being created by these systems and demonstrating to leadership that this is already happening and that where it is happening, projects are having greater impact than the ones where they aren't, and that those benefits are accruing back to the universities.
Yeah. That impact metric is one that is a mystery. And I suggest that the way you have to get your management to understand your impact is you have to be able to measure that impact and be able to promote what you're doing in a way that says, while this is an open source project, I'm not making oodles of money, but I'm having this sort of impact in the world is an important way to get that done.
Yeah, hi. It seems like achieving success in this entrepreneurship model requires all kinds of skills like marketing and customer relations and fundraising and community building. And I'm just imagining that somebody developing a project might have none of those skills. They have all kinds of skills in some technical niche or some discipline. And so what's the answer? Is the answer to train them, or can your kind of group come in and give them that kind of support?
Yes, to all of that. The training is important, but first, just understanding how to build a community and get an understanding of how that ecosystem works. People are always surprised by teams that have a Slack channel or a Discord channel, and that's part of the way they've developed their software and their thinking at the beginning, which unlocks the communication, right? And that's part of just the first step of making this happen. University of Michigan is starting a course that is parallel to the course that I do for the NSF. We can do that at Berkeley, we can do it at UCSC, we can do it at UCSD. It does take time and effort to do that and to get those people into the course, but we have a lot of experience with iCore doing this for the past 15 years, so it fits very much into that model. Then it's a matter of sustainability. It's like, how much is it going to cost to have the tools? Hopefully nothing. Hopefully the educators are cheap and we can transmit this information really fast and we can get you up and running. And then it becomes embodied as an entrepreneurial activity by those individuals. So, process. Yep.
I was just going to make a comment. Yeah, my name is Corey Levinson. I'm in the soil and biogeochemistry grad group at UC Davis. To the previous question about how we connect and reach out to leadership, and from my perspective, there's another community very adjacent and tightly overlaps with this open source community, which is the fair data world, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And within science, I think that that's maybe an easier entry point in a way, but I really don't see the fair community and the open source community holding hands and saying, here's how we disambiguate between these communities. Here's how we collectively approach leadership in a university context. And I feel like that could maybe help the cause to really figure out how to navigate that from a branding perspective and a community growth and development. Because I think the aims are very aligned.
The aims are definitely aligned. I would agree with that. And I think the two communities need to come together. But let me just say, from a cultural standpoint, the change that's required is going to take time. And so if I look at the long term, I think about that chart that I showed you for the UC Berkeley ecosystem. It took 25 years to build that. Bringing those two cultures together is going to take 5 to 10 years. And so you have to play the long game here and just get things started, understand who your community is and meet the people that is in that community and bring them together. So I would say that's a longer term project. Yeah. Okay.
Last question. Sorry. Go for it. We're out of time, so unfortunately, I'm so sorry. Last question. Go for it. No, go for it. Go for it.
I was going to ask, do you see any sort of sea change with respect to offices of innovation and commercialization with respect to open source efforts? And then are things like Open Innovation Network or patent pools or other kinds of mechanisms increasingly important, or kind of just one of many pieces of the puzzle?
So it's a really interesting topic when you bring up, patent pools and other activities that, let's say, Berkeley's IPURA organization might get involved in. That's been occurring for a very long time.
Yeah, I was going to speak to that. I'm in that office.
Yeah, hi, Mike.
Well, can you grab a microphone? Just one. Thanks, Juanita.
Introduce yourself as you go. And you're one of the speakers later, so.
Yeah, I'm on a panel later. Mike Alvarez-Cohen, Director of Innovation Ecosystem Development in UC Berkeley's Office of Intellectual Property and Industry Research Alliance. It's the IP management office that you're referring to. And we work with a lot of researchers on open source software, and many of them have been quite successful. Most recently, Databricks, which is based on open source Spark. And so sometimes when I listening to the questions here, I'm not quite sure what the problem that some people are referring to here. There's a vibrant open source community on the UC Berkeley campus. It's not formally organized. It's not hierarchical. Like, for example, Berkeley AI Research, BEAR, has a lot of open source activity. On my panel later today, I think it's about 4 o'clock, we're going to talk about a lot of examples. So I'm not quite sure if we need some kind of hierarchical formal organization in that chart that Dave, you showed earlier. Yeah. Because, for example, if you go to Skydeck, our flagship startup accelerator, and your business model is based on open source software, then the mentoring and the coaching and the guidance is commensurate with that kind of business model. So there again, I think there's a lot of activity here that we'll talk about, I guess, throughout this conference.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of conversations today, and you're going to learn a lot from Mike and the fellow panelists, and also the people who have done really successful commercial activities. And Databricks is just one of them. There have been many, many others. There's a question over here.
And I'm really sorry. I'm going to chase you off the stage now.
You got it.
And yes, you can go and ask Mike questions, give him some information, answer that question of what are the problems, what are the outstanding challenges. And please grab a cup of coffee, have a cup of tea or some water. And could you please give David a big round of applause, and thank you so much.